Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Eric Potashnik, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy and Director of the MPA program here at the Watson Institute. I first want to thank again Mitch Julis and the Julis Rabinowitz family for sponsoring this event. We are very grateful for their generous support. And welcome to today's panel on why competition in the politics industry is failing America. Let me just say a few words by way of background. As the Democrats prepare to take control of the House, the U.S. faces daunting challenges, from addressing rising inequality, wage stagnation, and the opioid epidemic, to controlling healthcare costs, budget deficits, and the environmental risks associated with climate change. Many political observers have expressed doubts as to whether our leaders are up to these tasks. The unleashing of populist forces and the challenge to democratic norms that we're witnessing today is arguably less the cause of our difficulties than a symptom of deeper problems in our governing system and a reflection of the erosion of Americans' trust in politicians, parties, and political institutions. So what caused the decay of American democracy, and how do we get out of our present predicament? These questions are receiving intense scrutiny from political scientists, including many of the people in this room, who study discrete topics like elections, public opinion, Supreme Court confirmation battles, media coverage, polarization, and Congress. Today's opening panel offers a different, more conceptual perspective on the challenges of our democracy. Our keynote speakers, Katherine Gehl and Michael Porter, are not political scientists or insiders, but rather are business experts who bring a new analytical lens to understanding the performance of our political system, the lens of industry competition. This type of analysis has long been used to understand competition and performance in other industries, and Gehl and Porter argue that it sheds new light on the root cause of our governance failures and how we might get out of them. Let me say a few words about each of our speakers. Katherine Gehl is a business leader author. She was president and CEO of Gehl Foods, a $250 million high-tech food manufacturing company in Wisconsin, where she led a transformational growth strategy, receiving multiple awards before selling the company in 2015. Her career includes roles in the private and public sectors, including Oracle, Bernstein Investment Research and Management, Mayor Richard Daley's office in the city of Chicago, and the Chicago Public Schools. In 2011, she was confirmed by the United States Senate to serve on the board of Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Today, she describes herself as a political innovation activist. She graduated from the University of Notre Dame and holds an MA from Catholic University and an MBA from Kellogg. Michael Porter, who's sitting to my right, is an economist, researcher, author, advisor, and teacher. Throughout his lifetime career at the Harvard Business School, he has brought economic theory and strategy concepts to bear on many of the most challenging problems facing corporations, economies, and societies, including market competition and company strategy, economic development, the environment, and healthcare. He's the author of 19 books and over 130 articles today in economics and business. He graduated from Princeton and holds an MBA from Harvard and a PhD from Harvard's Department of Economics. We're also very fortunate today to have as our discussant Ian Shapiro. Ian is Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale, where he also serves as Henry Luce Director of the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. He's written widely and influentially on democracy, justice, and the methods of social inquiry. A native of South Africa, he received his JD from Yale Law School and his PhD from Yale Political Science, where he's taught since 1984. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. His most recent book, co-authored with Francis McCall Rosenbluth, is Responsible Parties, Saving Democracy from Itself, published by Yale University Press. So welcome all, and looking forward to the conversation. Katherine.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, everybody, for having us here today. We're thrilled and honored because as newcomers to the political analysis, we really appreciate the opportunity to engage today. We also want to thank many of you in this community, in this room and outside, who have influenced our work, as evidenced by our 12 pages of footnotes and bibliography in our single publication to date. We owe a lot to so many. As Eric explained, we are going to deliver our presentation today almost exactly as we deliver it to other audiences around the country who are uniformly not political scientists. They're mostly business and sophisticated professional audiences whose biggest concern about the political system is actually not understanding it, They just want to know how they could fix it. Some way, somehow, anyway, what could be done. In most cases, much of our audience is deeply engaged in politics in the sense that they care deeply about what candidate is winning and losing, or oftentimes about policy. But they are not, in most cases, familiar with any of the details of the political system. So as experts in the field, a bit of a challenge this morning is that you are going to know every single one of the rules and practices we highlight in the examples we provide. And you will also know others that we don't even know that may illustrate these same points. But we decided not to take any of that color and story out of the presentation, not because we're trying to bore you, and I hope it doesn't do that, but so that we could present what is resonating across the country with the larger group of people who are so concerned about the system, as Eric discussed. And so also that you will see how we build the case for reform exactly as we build it for others. Now, whenever we are therefore telling you something obvious, I would invite you and perhaps even implore you to pretend that it's all new news, because that is how it occurs for most of our audiences, and it is through the sort of shock of some of these things that they say, oh, wow, maybe we should make a change. I almost always start with a quick story about my daughter, who's 13 years old, but a couple of years ago when she was 9, we're in the car, which is where I keep her captive, you know, like we do with our children. And I tell her things she doesn't normally want to talk about. And I said, hey, Alexandra, did you know that our national debt is $19 trillion? She loves being in the car, you know. And she looked at me and she said, no. And I said, yeah, really. And guess who's going to have to pay that back? And now she's really horrified, and her face says, you? Oh, no, honey, not me. That's not how it works. You're going to have to pay that back. And she responded by saying, me? What did I ever do? So as the conversations that I force upon my daughter indicate, I care deeply about our politics. And Michael and I came together to do this work out of a shared frustration over the trajectory of the country and the failure of Washington, D.C. to solve our most critical problems, which I saw and experienced firsthand in my role as CEO of my company in Wisconsin. For years now, there's been 24/7 talk of the dysfunction and the drama out of D.C., but there's been no comprehensive, actionable strategy that looked to us in the business community and professional community to have any chance of changing things. The best we could do as citizens and business leaders is double down on our party, certain that the other side must be the problem, or keep searching for that next great change candidate who was finally going to fix things. Obama was a change candidate, and Trump was a change candidate. But we all know the saying, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And what we're doing simply isn't working. So in 2016, I approached Michael with the idea of using this new lens, this new approach. Politics is an industry. So let's use the tools of industry structure and competition thinking that Michael originally invented to analyze for-profit industries, now to analyze the industry of politics, the huge business that politics has become. And as Eric mentioned, this type of analysis has been used for decades to understand competition in other industries. In fact, one of the main reasons why this work is resonating so well with the business community is because they are deeply familiar with this framework and know how well it has worked for them to understand the dynamics in their own industries. And using these tools to look at politics sheds new light on the failures because politics in America is a major industry that functions very much similarly to other industries. Our political problems are clearly not due to a single cause, but rather, in our view, to a failure of the nature of political competition that's been created. And of course, Michael and I are not political scientists. We're not even political insiders or political experts. What we're doing is different. The primary purpose of our work is galvanizing action, and we're in particular targeting the business and professional community who have been essentially MIA in the dialogue of what we can do to transform the politics that depresses so many so much. We were very clear right from the start that we shouldn't simply add to the depressing commentary about politics, but rather endeavor to figure out precisely what it would take to change the system, not for the sake of change itself, but rather to change reliably the types of results that the system delivers. And please know that when we talk today, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, it's not about politics. I mean, Michael is a Republican. He likes it if I say he's a Massachusetts Republican. And I used to be a Democrat, and now I'm a centrist independent. And the problem, in our view, is not Democrats or Republicans or the existence of parties, per se. The problem is this nature of competition. And this morning we'll give you an overview of what, according to this framework, has gone wrong, and what, according to this framework, would be the comprehensive strategy that we could collectively employ to fix it. I'll turn it over to Michael.
I'm sitting over here so we don't have to go through this process. But first of all, thank you all for being here. And again, as Catherine has said, we're not political scientists. I'm not a political scientist. I am a scholar, but I never had worked in this field and never had read very much of the literature until about 5 years ago when this journey started. And I want to tell you all, we have drawn incredibly heavily on your work. There's a huge literature here. There's a lot of terrific literature. There's a lot of tremendous data and knowledge that's been created about the political system. And that's been very, very important to us trying to get our arms around and think about how this system actually works, looking at it from this lens that Catherine has talked about. Politics is the last thing I thought I would ever work on. You know, I'm a competition scholar. I work on competition and strategy with very much of a focus on imperfect competition. I don't do models. We try to build frameworks to think about the richness of actual competition in real industries. My other major field is competitiveness and economic development for countries, for regions, for states and cities. It's really that latter body of work that is why I got into this work and started working with Catherine some years ago. We set out at HBS a number of years ago to do something we call the U.S. Competitiveness Project, because we were seeing a very disturbing pattern of performance in the U.S. economy. Very disturbing, breaking decades and decades of precedent. And this all started well before the Great Recession. If you look at the data on the economic performance of America, well before the Great Recession, we saw peaks of things like workforce participation and wage growth and things like that. And we were very concerned at the school that we needed to weigh into trying to understand what was going on in the economy, what was going wrong. And I co-chaired that effort because that's one of the areas that I work actively in. So what did we do? Well, we set out to study the performance of the U.S. economy and what might be the problem in the U.S. economy. And this is just one of the charts that was developed in the course of that work and has been extended and developed in publication after publication after that work. And this is a very simple chart that just kind of shows what's happening to the business environment in America. And this actually comes from surveying all of our HBS alumni who are in all kinds of important positions in the economy and getting their perspective and then validating all these findings with actual data. And you see on the bottom half, we got a lot of areas where the U.S. has been deteriorating. We've got a lot of still great strengths on the upper right-hand corner. We're really strong in certain key areas in the U.S., but what we discovered was that what had happened was there's a lot of erosion in our position in areas that you'll all recognize. Areas like, our skilled labor position is declining. Our education system keeps getting worse relative to our peers. We have a ridiculously expensive legal system. Regulatory system is inflicting a lot of cost in a lot of industries. we saw that our economic competitiveness in the U.S. economy had been deteriorating. Our cost of doing business was going up. And this is something that was, creating, great anxiety on the part of the business community and other people worried about where the U.S. economy was going. So, this is what I do a lot when I'm looking at countries or regions. We assess kind of the competitive position. What we saw was we're going in the wrong direction. Almost nothing was getting better. A lot of things were getting worse, things that were foundational. And that was leading to a lot of inequality and asymmetry of results among American citizens, and was causing a lot of shifts in investment across industries and so forth. So as a result, we at the school came up with what we call the 8-point plan. And we identified sort of 8 key policy areas that would have the most impact in a reasonable amount of time on kind of turning the tide on U.S. competitiveness. And these are all areas you would all recognize: tax policy, budgets, all those kind of things. And this is where I kind of perceived a sort of epiphany here. Because we developed these 8-point areas, and then I made like 15 trips to Washington. And I met with hundreds of members of Congress. And we would go into their offices, and we would talk about our diagnosis of what's going on in the U.S. economy. Why is our performance so lousy? Why are we having wage stagnation? Why are we having all this stuff? We would go through the diagnosis, and they would nod their head. Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. I agree with that. And then we would put forward the 8-point plan and say, okay, these are the 8 areas where these are not everything we have to fix, but these are some of the critical things that we have to fix. Including corporate tax reform, including various other kinds of reforms that you would all totally recognize. And they would, and believe it or not, to a person, every meeting we had, they said, yeah, we need to fix all those areas. We need to get a sustainable budget. We need to reduce our cost of doing business in these areas. But we agree with you. But then as I was leaving, and these were, by the way, private meetings, with individual people in their offices, all the wood paneling and all that you see in Washington. And as I was leaving, they would say, I really agree with your analysis and what you guys say we need to do. We respect, the Harvard Business School's, analysis here. But I'm going to tell you, it's going to be really hard to do this. And I kind of listened to that, but at the time, it didn't really sink in what they were really saying. When it really sank in was as we went back and studied the history of economic policy in the U.S. for the last 4 or 5 decades. And what we discovered was that the U.S. has made virtually zero progress on any of these issues. We've gone decade after decade after decade without fixing our infrastructure, without fixing our tax system, without dealing with, all the cost of the legal system. We're stuck. We're stuck in America. I finally decided that I work on policy. That's not the problem. We know the policies that we need to enact. We know the areas in which we need to improve. But we're not getting it done. And that was when the lightning bolt hit me that what you guys do is much more important than what I was doing, which is studying why we're not able to deliver on the solutions we need to the problems this country has. And what we discovered was that, it's not a policy problem, it's a politics problem. What you guys are doing is the most important agenda facing this country now. Not figuring out how to do deal with gun violence in some pragmatic policy way. We know a lot about the policy. What we didn't understand is the politics. And then what I also learned is that it's not just economic. It's not just economic gridlock and failure to improve and solve problems that we face in this country. It also moves to the social agenda. We'd really had no systematic data on social progress, on the social agenda. But I led a team and a multi-year process to develop a comprehensive data set that allowed us to benchmark countries on many, many dimensions of the social agenda. This is just a little snapshot of some of that here. This is called the Social Progress Index, if any of you are interested. We can now compare performance on many, many, many social agenda items across 146 countries. We've always been able to measure competitiveness well, economic factors well, but we really hadn't been able to benchmark ourselves on social factors. And this slide just kind of shows some of the findings for the U.S. We Americans think that we are leaders in social policy. That's the worldview that most Americans have. Oh, we invented a lot of this stuff. We were the first to do universal primary education. We were first to do this. We were first to do that. But what you see now is if we actually look at real data, we have now sunk to the bottom of the OECD. These are the 36 relatively advanced countries. Let me just give you one data point. On maternal mortality, the U.S. is now 35th among the 36 OECD countries. Now, the 35th and 36 countries are like Chile and Lithuania, you know. This is not the high bar. This is the low bar. And actually, on maternal mortality, overall, compared to all countries, the U.S. is now 62nd. So what we discovered was not only had we made no progress on the economic agenda, but we were making no progress on the social agenda. And what we know now from all the scholarly work we've done in this field is if you're not making social progress, eventually it's going to bring down your economic progress. Because you've got to create those social foundations in education and other areas that allow you to progress. What's the message here? The message here is our system of government, our democracy, is failing miserably to meet the needs of the citizens. We're not solving the problems that are most important to the country. And this is a central core outcome that every democracy should be able to achieve. So why couldn't we deliver solutions? Why couldn't we deliver real progress? Why were we stuck? And why had this seemingly gotten worse over time? America was a leader, a pioneer in many areas of economic and social policy for decades and decades and decades. But what we discovered was we've kind of come to a screeching halt at this particular moment in history. And that halt has been getting slower and slower, but now we're literally at a halt. And the question is, why? What happened? Now, again, this is your field, but for us, this was a huge puzzle. How could this happen? And to try to unscramble that problem, we started trying to approach this with a somewhat different way. And so let me turn it back over to Catherine, and we'll talk a little bit about how we attack this issue, how we looked at it. Again, drawing on a lot of your work, but hopefully looking at it with a somewhat different perspective, coming from people who'd been really looking at industries and industry competition for many decades. So, Catherine.
Thank you, Michael. So how many times have we all said or heard Washington is broken? As my good friend, and some of you may know him, former Congressman Mickey Edwards, originally explained, this idea represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. In fact, Washington is working exactly how it's designed to work. Now, how can our political system be so perfectly designed and yet deliver such dismal results? The answer that we came up with is that it's not designed for us. Actually, the system has been designed and fine-tuned and optimized over time for the benefit of private gain-seeking organizations, which are two political parties and all of their industry allies, which together comprise what we call the political industrial complex. We also call it the duopoly, and when we do so, it always refers to this collective set of actors across the entire spectrum of the industry, not just the two major political parties themselves. The confusion in most of the country is that we've been assuming, rather naturally, that the political system has been designed to work for us, the citizens, the voters, the public interest. And I always give two quick examples for our presentations, because in each case, the political system, when we look underneath that proverbial hood, works quite differently than what most people imagine. I'm going to share the first one with you, even though you'll be familiar with it. so you can understand how we bring this forth for people. So think back to when Joe Biden became vice president in 2009. His Senate seat was then open in Delaware, and everyone in Delaware apparently knew that the next senator from the state of Delaware was going to be Mike Castle. And yet we've never heard of Senator Mike Castle, because Mike Castle ran in his Republican primary and he lost, you'll recall, to Christine O'Donnell. And that was shocking. But really, for those who don't know the rules, that shouldn't be any kind of a problem, because we would think, well, how about Mike Castle just turn around and put himself on that November ballot as an independent because he's the most popular politician in the state and he would have won. But the problem for Mike Castle was that Delaware has a bit of a crazy law, particularly to those of us who had never previously heard of it, called the sore loser law. And as you know, that means that if you run in your party's primary and you lose, Democrat or Republican, you are not allowed to be on the general election ballot in November, no matter what the citizens want. So a rational question that we then ask is, how many states have a law like this crazy, undemocratic Delaware law? And of course, the answer is 44 states. I live in one, and so do most of you. Now, we can all remember when Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman lost his 2006 Senate primary, and yet there still was Senator Joe Lieberman because he ran as an independent candidate in the general election and won, which clearly indicated that that's who the citizens of Connecticut wanted. But he could do that because Connecticut was then one of only 4 states without a sore loser law. And there are a few other things that it's really important that we understand about partisan primaries. They're publicly funded, but if we think about it, they're really selection processes to determine the candidate for these private partisan organizations. And primaries are the reason that so many people show up at the general election and think, wow, I really don't like the choices that I have. Because most elections are really decided in the primaries, especially in gerrymandered districts. And so voters who turn out for partisan primaries tend to be more ideological than the electorate as a whole. And therefore, to make it through the primary, then the candidates will go further to the right or the left than voters as a whole really want. But even more critically, the influence of the partisan primary extends into the legislative process to actually trying to solve the problems Michael had on our slides. So let's imagine yourself as a politician. It's not just what you have to say to get elected. It's once you're elected and you have an opportunity to consider a bipartisan compromise, an actual solution to one of our nation's biggest problems. The operative question that you must ask is not, is this a good idea? Is this the right policy for the country? Is this what the majority of my constituents want? No. You have to ask, can I make it back through the eye of the needle that is my partisan primary if I vote for this? And if the answer is no, the other answers are almost wholly irrelevant because the rational incentive to get reelected directs you to vote no. And if you do decide to vote yes anyway, but your side of the political industrial complex doesn't want you to do that, then you will likely be threatened with a primary. Primary is not just a noun anymore. It's now a verb, as in, we're going to primary you. And as you guys know, that means we're going to run someone further to your right if you're a Republican and further to your left if you're a Democrat. It never means we're going to run someone, a more consensus, problem-solving oriented independent candidate to your middle. Partisan primaries combined with partisan gerrymandering are key tools that the two parties, what we collectively call the duopoly, use to control the political process. And it effectively forces our elected officials, both left and right. And this division makes it very difficult to govern. We can all start to understand why so little gets done in Washington, D.C. Then after this, when I'm speaking to other audiences, I always give an example from the legislative process where I talk about the Hastert Rule, and that as an example of the legislative machinery and its perversion by the political industrial complex to be used for partisan purposes. People are very shocked to discover that legislation supported by a majority of the country, and oftentimes by a majority of the House, the entire House, will have absolutely no chance of passing because there will never even be a vote. And then I explain how the 2013 government shutdown, 16 days of shutdown, were essentially the result of the Hastert rule and partisan control of the process, not because the country wanted the shutdown and not because there weren't the votes from day one to avert or end that shutdown. It turns out, that my daughter actually describes this best, and she says I can share her joke with you, which is, if con is the opposite of pro, then isn't Congress the opposite of progress? And you might have heard it, but other people think it's funny. So the truth is that the U.S. political system is not a public institution. It's a private industry. It's a classic duopoly. And in the duopoly, the players naturally advance their own interests instead of the public interest. What's unique about the politics industry as compared to almost every other industry is that there's no independent regulation. The actors in the industry are the ones that themselves make the rules of the game. Most people mistakenly think the rules of the political system are set in the Constitution, but for the most part, that's not true. In fact, it turns out that the most powerful rules that govern the incentives driving day-to-day behavior and legislation are set by the political industrial complex and for their benefit. As is always the case in life, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played, and the net result of the rules of the game in the politics industry is unhealthy competition. Unhealthy competition in elections and unhealthy competition in legislating. And the result of unhealthy competition is that customers are not well served. So thus, the actors in the political system are thriving at the same time as the American public has never been more dissatisfied. So just last fall, a new Gallup poll came out, and 61% of Americans think a new party is needed. And the percentage of Americans self-identifying as independent is at the all-time high as of July, 43% versus 29% saying Democrat, 25% saying Republican. And here's a key insight from this competition framework. In any other industry this big, doing this well in terms of growth and power and revenues and size, but with this much customer dissatisfaction and only two players, you would see a new entrant, an entrepreneur who wants to address that customer satisfaction and grow a new company. Some entrepreneur would see it as this phenomenal business opportunity, and we would see these new competitors responding to what customers want, but that doesn't happen in politics because, as Michael's going to show you, the parties work very well together in one particular way: to rig the rules of the game to protect themselves jointly from new competition. And to do that, they erect what we call in business huge barriers to entry. So put another way, politics isn't broken, it's fixed, as in corrupt. This, to the business people, pretty much to a person, looks like a phenomenal antitrust case. But you certainly, and then they are not eventually surprised to know that ever so conveniently, antitrust regulation simply doesn't apply to politics industry. And troublingly, there's no accountability built in for any of this. There's no accountability because the customer only has two choices. The only thing each party has to do to win is convince the average voter to choose them as the lesser of two evils, or to choose them because at least they say, therefore, what that voter believes. But what the parties don't have to do in a duopoly is to deliver results. Because no matter how disappointed you are, you still likely prefer what your party says, therefore, than what the other party says, therefore. Or, as in a recent conversation that I had looking at the midterms, even people who may be very disappointed with the current Republican administration, but they've been lifelong Republicans, that disappointment does not necessarily then make them Democrats. And that is the complex problem of the duopoly in a political system. And in this case, it means that instead of results in the public interest, we get gridlock. This chart, and thank you, Sarah Binder, to whom we owe this fabulous chart. This chart shows the percentage of salient issues deadlocked in Congress, and we, of course, see this relentless increase from 1947 to today, leading to the previous high water mark of 74%. And when we do get something done, it's partisan. A striking implication of the industry structure and how it's gotten a lot worse is shown in this slide. Landmark legislation used to pass with bipartisan support. So if we see the combination of red and blue votes on the left for Social Security, highways, civil rights, and welfare reform, but today, important legislation is passed only on partisan lines. So we can see all blue for health care and Dodd-Frank and all red for tax cuts. And when the other party retakes power after these singular partisan actions, they focus not on improving but repealing. This happens in part because there simply aren't enough moderates left who can bridge the gap between the extremes of the two sides. This slide shows the decline in moderates over time on both the Republican and Democrat sides. And everyone knows it's broken. Here we see the dramatic decline in public trust in the federal government from 1958 to 2017. Now, if the competition in the politics industry were healthy, industry actors would be competing to serve the public interest, and they would also be held accountable for that, and you would see the public's satisfaction or dissatisfaction reflected in the industry. But we know they're not. So the question is, why not? And for that, we'll turn it over to Michael to use these tools of industry structure and delve in detail into what's going on in that industry.
Thanks, Catherine. So the question then is, how do we understand the outcomes that we're getting? How do we understand the kind of rich reality of how this complex industry works? There's a long tradition in political science of looking at the analogy between economic competition and political competition, and we've drawn on that and respect that work. I think what this framework does is it builds much more on a deep, sort of imperfect model of competition. We see all competition as imperfect competition. Every industry is imperfect competition. There's no such thing as perfect competition anymore. And all the work that we do in HBS and in dealing with kind of industry analysis and competition in practice in business is really rooted in the imperfection and institutional details of the industry in question. Now, the framework we use is affectionately called the Five Forces by our students, and this framework is quite broadly applied across industries all around the world, actually. And essentially, it says that to understand an industry, you have to understand the underlying structure. Not the processes that the industry goes through, but the underlying structure of the industry. And to understand the underlying structure, there's a kind of conception of that has proven to be very, very powerful in practice in looking at actual real industries, which I do for most of my living. And that's a reflection of this slide tries to summarize that in the politics industry. So the industry has five forces. The center of competition is, of course, the rivals that are going, head to head to deliver whatever, to achieve whatever success they want to achieve. In this industry, we have rivals, the two parties and the associated actors competing to win elections and also to get their way in governing. So we have kind of two parallel kinds of competition going on here. Every industry has customers. Who are we trying to serve? Ultimately, the customers are the citizens, us. But what we see here that we'll talk about in a minute is we actually, citizens, are not the most important customers of this industry. This is not who the parties are really trying to serve. They're not trying to serve the average voter. So we really have to understand from a strategy point of view, who are they trying to serve and how has that been structured? To reach customers in any industry, often you have channels of reaching customers. We just list the channels in politics. There's direct voter engagement that often involves ground games and infrastructure in this industry, paid advertising. Traditionally, media are critical actors to get to the public and tell the story. The idea of independent media is somewhat becoming extinct in the system over time, and then social media has come along. And the way in which the rivals relate to the channels is very important to the nature of competition in this industry. Every industry has suppliers that provide the inputs that are needed to actually compete in the industry. Here we have candidates, we have campaign talent, the pollsters, the campaign managers, all the talent you need to run campaigns. They've gotten very complicated, very sophisticated. Voter data is now epically important to actually running, and there's suppliers of that voter data. There are companies that have collected that data and aggregated that data and do the analytics. There are think tanks that are in the idea business. Think tanks have been around for a long time, but again, think tanks have been changing dramatically in how they look and what they do. And then there's, of course, lobbyists who are the ones that are taking the messages out and trying to influence the people in government to do whatever the lobbyists are paid to try to get people to do. So those are kind of the key kind of actors in the kind of direct development of politics and the development of legislation and passing law and so forth. And then in any other industry, we have to think really hard about two other things. We have to think about who are the new entrants, what's the threat of new entry, and that, of course, fundamentally determined by the barriers to entry. So any industry analysis always looks at the barriers to entry. What are the barriers to entry here? If these guys aren't doing a good job, why don't new people come in? How hard is that? Barriers to entry allow dysfunctional behavior that doesn't serve customers to persist. So we've got a good sense that there's got to be high barriers here. We haven't had a new party since I think it's 1854 that's had any significance. So it's seemingly hard to create a new party, really, really hard. And we got to understand exactly why and where that came from. And then finally, there's substitutes. A substitute is a competitor that doesn't look like the existing competitor. So that would be Amazon competing with a brick and mortar retailer. That's a substitute. A direct rival would be another brick and mortar retailer. A substitute would be somebody like Amazon. In this case, the substitute we could think of as an independent. An independent isn't the party thing. It's a different model for competing in the system. And the question then is, well, why don't we see success of independents? Particularly if so many people name themselves as independents. Why haven't they taken over? Why did all the independents lose last week? What happened? And again, if there's this way, the substitutes are usually the disruptors. They come in and disrupt the existing system. Why aren't the disruptors disrupting this mess that we have? Why hasn't somebody come in and changed it? And I think we're going to have plenty of time to talk about Q&A a little bit later, okay? So what's going on here? Using kind of industry competition thinking, we would sort of make the following fundamental conclusions about this industry and how this competition actually works. The first thing we'd say is that the most important customers for this industry are not the average voters. A smart industry, and particularly in a duopoly where you only have two competitors and they're the key actors, a smart industry finds the most profitable customers to serve. And in this industry, what creates profit, quote unquote, for the parties? Well, reliable votes that support what they want to do and money, okay? And what we believe is the actual core customer here is the partisan primary voter, the person that's obsessed with their issue and their ideological tie to the party, and special interests. People who have a particular interest because of their industry or because of their circumstances in a particular kind of outcome that is often heavily dependent on ideology. The parties don't serve the middle. They don't compete for the middle. This has been a epically important idea in kind of some of the literature in political science. We don't think that's the way it works. They don't compete for the middle. They've divided the voters. Why don't you compete for the middle? Because if you compete for the middle, it's hard to win that competition. It's hard to sustain competitive advantage. What's happened if you compete for the middle is you'll really usually dissipate the profitability of the industry, and you'll be more accountable. If you're all competing for the same customers, you'll be more accountable. The parties have been very evolved to a point where they really divided the voters into two camps. The core customers of these partisan camps that are most aligned with their ideology, and the middle doesn't matter. The studies in political science, the Princeton Northwestern study, really shows that the average voter has no impact on policy. That's not how it works, because they're not the most important customer. That's not who these competitors are actually trying to serve. Political competition is not about solutions. It's not about solving the problem of immigration. If it were about that, we might get some results. The political competition is about ideology. It's about taking steps that are consistent with these ideological views that are really embedded in the two parties in important ways. But we know that ideology is never the way the world works. Ideology is too simple. It's a cartoon. It's religion. And what happens is that by competing on ideology, what we come up with and what we propose are too simple. They don't actually create real solutions. Think of the recent tax reform. That was a rotten tax bill. It was horrendous. It was an ideological tax bill. We know much more about how to optimize a corporate tax reform. We know we could have done it much better. We wasted too much money. We cut the rates too high. It wasn't about that. It was about supporting and developing and serving the customer with ideology. Parties don't compromise anymore. Why? Because if they compromise, they're actually really disappointing their core customers. So we don't see compromise. Parties, as Catherine said, don't have to deliver to the average voter because given the dynamic she described, if the parties are serving their customers well, the average voter is rarely going to swing so much that it's going to threaten their persistence. And then, of course, there's no new competition because the barriers to entry are indeed very, very high. Incumbency advantages, economies of scale, running elections all over the country, tying up the key suppliers. The suppliers are very aligned now with the party. There's Republican suppliers and Democrat suppliers. If you're a Republican campaign manager, you would never work for a Democrat. The voter data is controlled by party-connected organizations. The think tanks have divided up between the parties in many cases and simply raised the barriers to entry for somebody new trying to get into the game. Barriers to entry are substantial. But as Catherine said, despite this bitter competition that we talk about, the rules have been set to protect the parties as a group. Okay, the rules have been set to keep high barriers to entry. Financing rules. A single donor can contribute $845,000 annually to a political party, the Democrats or the Republicans. A voter can contribute $5,400 every 2 years to an independent candidate. $850,000 to a very small number. So what we see here is a situation where this competition is rational, is clever, it serves the party's interest, it's working, but it's not delivering results for the average citizen. So let me turn it over to Catherine to develop the what do we do about this? I mean, that is the operative question.
Thank you. So for our business audiences, I always tell them, okay, we're now to the optimistic part, the forward-looking part, after we've thoroughly depressed everybody. We're also today to the fast-talking part. So in any game, board game, sports game, serious games like politics, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played. And you can change the rules in basketball and get a faster or slower game. You can put a three-point line in and send people to take shots from different areas of the court. You change the way the game is played, and you change the outcome of the games. And we can change the rules of the game in any industry and get different results. The problem is that most of the rules of the game of politics are not in the Constitution, they're made up. But as I've said before, they've been made up to serve partisans, not to solve problems. So to transform the system, we have to re-engineer the rules of the game to incent healthy competition on dimensions that serve the public interest. That's my fault. It's underscoring the importance. It's both that simple and that hard. What we need is a comprehensive reform strategy. Every reform in our strategy is at the intersection of powerful and achievable. A reform is powerful only if it addresses a root cause of the unhealthy competition. A reform is achievable only if we can measure success in years, not decades. And so only reforms at the intersection of powerful and achievable are in this strategy. Now, as you will certainly know, there are no reforms at the intersection of powerful, achievable, and easy. But we do have some of powerful and achievable, and our strategy focuses on 4 of those. But for the moment, I'm going to talk only about the first one, because it's by far the most important. We absolutely must re-engineer the elections machinery, and by elections machinery, I therefore mean these rules of the game for elections. We have 2 elections innovations, and when implemented as a package, they will fundamentally change key incentives for what our politicians do. Elections machinery innovation number 1 is to institute open top 4 primaries. We call it 4 forward, 4 move forward to the general election. So we're going to eliminate partisan primaries where you vote in the Republican primary or the Democrat primary. Instead, when you go to the primary, there's only one ballot, and every candidate, no matter their party, including third parties and independents, every candidate running the primary appears on that single ballot. So nobody votes in the Democrat primary or the Republican primary. The top 4 vote getters out of that election advance to the general election. You combine that with election innovation number 2, which is ranked choice voting in the general election. So allow me to back up a moment. There are 2 critical structural problems, according to our framework, in the existing elections. First, the partisan primaries, that eye of the needle that we already talked about. And then here's one more. The fact that in the United States, we use plurality voting to determine the winner. So plurality voting creates 2 significant barriers to entry that we just talked about. One is the spoiler argument. So sometimes, as we know, we don't vote for the candidate we really want out of fear that our vote will inadvertently help elect the candidate that we like the least. And the second and related problem with plurality voting is the wasted vote argument. So whenever we want to vote for someone who's not considered likely to have a strong chance of winning, it's said we're spoiling the vote for someone else, spoiling the election for someone else, or we're simply wasting our vote. And both the spoiler argument and the wasted vote argument are wielded against all potential new competition to the duopoly, and these are a key reason why we do not have healthy competition. Ranked choice voting eliminates these problems and ensures that we elect the candidate with the broadest appeal to the most number of voters. And of course, I'm going to skip the slides on how that works. Normally I explain that to people. It's basically a series of runoffs, but you don't have to come back. You cast all your votes at once. And importantly, we tell the audience, they're not crazy new ideas. Australia's voted this way for a century, and if we listen quickly...
Hello, this is Senator John McCain. I'm calling to urge your support for ballot measure 1 on August 27th. As a presidential candidate and as a senator, I've worked hard to open up the political process for all Americans. Ballot measure 1 will adopt a fairer voting method. It will lead to good government because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters. Please vote yes on measure 1 on August 27th.
That's John McCain in 2002, a robocall in Alaska supporting their referendum on ranked choice voting. And it gets a little bit better because here we have Illinois Senate Bill 1789, also in 2002, and this co-sponsor is then State Senator Barack Obama, proposing ranked choice voting for all state and congressional elections. John McCain, Barack Obama, two talented politicians and public servants who really knew how the game is played. And they were ahead of their time on this reform, but we believe that now the time has come. Together, these reforms, forward, and ranked choice voting will powerfully alter the incentives. So let's quickly imagine Congress post-reform. Now, when a member of Congress has a chance, once again, to consider action on this bipartisan compromise bill, they can vote yes if it's in the public interest. Because they can say, well, under the old system of competition, I simply wouldn't have made it out of my primary. But under these new rules, I'm pretty confident I can make the top 4 in the primary, and then with a combination of first and second place votes in the general, I will craft a win. Elected officials now owe their election to a broader group of voters and are incented to be responsive to their entire district rather than the narrow swath of primary voters and special interests. The existing incentives for scorched earth campaigning and scorched earth committee hearings are reduced, and most importantly, the barriers to entry are dramatically lower for new competition, which will lead to healthy competition to serve the public interest. There are methods to implement these reforms around the country, which we can talk about in Q&A if people are interested. But what I will say in closing is a quote that you guys may know. Thomas Jefferson said, although to this group I better admit he didn't really say it according to our HBS fact checkers, in America we do not have government by the majority, we have government by the majority who participate.
We never have said it that way. But we get the point.
Yes, right. And you guys are, more discerning than most of my audiences, so I get away with it a little bit. So, the point for us, certainly for me, is that I always thought that meant I needed to participate by voting. But it turns out, in order for our democracy to be successful, we all have to participate in the design of the rules of the game as well. And reclaiming the promise that is the American experiment from these distorted rules of the game is the challenge of our times, and that's what we're committed to. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. I also teach at SOM at Yale, and for many years have taught the Porter Forces to generations of SOM students. So it's a real privilege to be on this panel with the author of the Porter Forces, and very nice to meet Catherine and listen to your presentation. So I agree with a great deal of the diagnosis of what's wrong, and I'm just going to very briefly mention the points of agreement, but then I'm going to, in the interest of time, focus on where there's disagreement. I agree on much of the diagnosis. I agree that the most important thing to focus on is the kind of competition that occurs and does not occur in the political system. I agree that using the tools of economics can be enormously helpful in thinking about what's wrong with political competition and how to fix it, and in particular using those tools to focus sharply on the incentives created for politicians in the system by whatever system of rules we have. I agree with many of the goals that they enunciate in the paper, particularly they list 4 goals, 2 of which I think are especially important. One is they call practical and effective solutions to national, I would underscore the national problems, and I'll come back to that. The capacity for action and buy-in over time. I think buy-in over time is also very important, and restoring faith in the system. I agree that the system works much more in the interests of primary voters, special interests, and donors, and much less in the interest of average voters and non-voters. So we're on the same page there. We agree that the role of money is particularly corrosive, And we all also agree that the large and increasing number of alienated voters all need to be addressed. So there's a lot of agreement before we start, but let me zero in on what we disagree about, and we can sharpen that. And I think it comes down to 4 or 5 issues where we have to bear in mind that despite the value of the tools of economic analysis, the market for political power is unlike other markets because it's a market for control of a national monopoly. We disagree about the problem being the duopoly. And here I think you can say, well, compared to what? And it's compared to multi-party systems, and I'm not going to spend time now, but the pathologies of multi-party systems are the pathologies of multi-party systems, in my view, are worse than the pathologies of well-functioning two-party systems. And so the question is how to get the two-party system to function better. Just to throw out a metaphor, in a well-functioning two-party system, the parties might be thought of as sort of like marriages, in the sense that they plan for the long haul. People think about internalizing the costs of their cooperation. They think about working out their differences over time, and there are divorces, but for the most part, they're trying to develop a brand that will persist over time, to go back into the language of economics. When you think about governments in multi-party systems, they're more like hookups. This is working for me right now, but I don't know who I'm going to be hooking up with next time. So they have the incentive to externalize the costs of their deals, and to be much more short-term in thinking about national policy. A third point of disagreement is that I think that the authors conflate or confuse the vice of compromise with the virtue of moderation. And this is a widespread problem in many analyses of what's wrong with American politics. And I think that the example of Joe Lieberman is very telling in this respect, in that if you look, Joe Lieberman was the 60th vote needed for Obamacare to pass in 2010. He was an independent caucusing with the Democrats, and he had signaled all along that he would support the bill. But 10 days before the vote, Joe Lieberman said he was going to withhold his vote unless the public option was removed from the bill. The public option had been put in there partly to keep the private providers honest, ensuring there would be some competition in every insurance market, and it was a possible path to an expansion of toward a single-payer system in the future, for which there wasn't the support yet, but they might become later. Why did he do that? It was not because the massive independent vote in Connecticut didn't want the public option in the Affordable Care Act. He did it because the insurance industry in America is largely headquartered in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and the insurance industry had poured huge amounts of money into Lieberman's campaigns. So he was serving exactly the kind of interest you don't want served when he did that. And so and there were others who extracted their own pounds of flesh from the bill. Ben Nelson's Cornhusker kickback, where there would be an infinite, into the indefinite future, federal funding of Nebraska's Medicaid expansion. You're worried about deals to perpetually spend more and more money. This is Exhibit A. Everybody's getting their stuff out of the bill. And so if you if you design a system that forces people to compromise, they're just going to keep extracting rents in order to deliver the compromise votes that are needed. And Obamacare, I think, is the ways in which a much better bill was damaged because of the need for compromise in order to get it through this legislature is an illustration of what I'm talking about. And so what we want is parties that in government can design moderate programs that will appeal to large numbers of voters, not systems that force compromise and allow rampant rent seeking from the people whose votes are needed. The big problem, in my judgment, therefore, is not the duopoly, but what's happened to the duopoly in recent decades. And what's happened is a massive weakening of the political parties, so that all of these other groups can control them from outside and through primaries. We will agree about that. Because of redistricting and demographic changes, and because of the rise of presidentialism, which further weakens the parties in the legislature. And so I don't want to take up too much time, but on the issue of solutions, going to a top four primary and a ranked voting systems. Essentially, you're sort of calling for jungle primaries. So, first of all, any kind of primary, the main reason primaries produce candidates that are a long way from the median voter is that there's extremely low turnout in primaries. And who turns out? The activists turn out, the people with intense preferences who tend to be on the extremes of the parties. So, you're not going to eliminate that problem with your top rank primary. Secondly, what you do if you have weak parties and you have open primaries is essentially you will create incentives for bidding wars to bring goods back to the district. Essentially, you've got people running to get elected in a district that have no incentive to think about what kind of national program could I support that others in my party could also support and could actually be enacted. I think it's not the case that the problem is partisan legislation. Francis Lee, I'm sure, will speak at much greater length about this issue than I will. I think the tax bill and Obamacare and Dodd-Frank are statistical outliers, but she knows much more about that than I do. But I would just point out that in 1946, the National Health Service was passed by the Labour Party in the face of strong opposition from the Tories and strong opposition from the British medical establishment. 70 years later, it's the most popular institution in Britain, more popular even than the Queen. Even during the Thatcher years, it was bulletproof and untouchable. If you think in the U.S., in 1965, Medicare was passed on strict party line vote, again against strong opposition. It's an extremely popular bill, single payer, what everybody calls socialized medicine, hugely popular. It's basically bulletproof. And Obamacare, with all its blemishes, again, the fact is they had found the sweet spot of the American voter, and so the Republicans found that it was basically impossible to repeal, even though it's just savaged on its way to passage because of the pathologies of the system. And so, in my judgment, what's needed is actually reforms that will strengthen political parties. And I don't see anything in what the authors are proposing that would do that. On the contrary, they would weaken parties even more. And so you would essentially have these elections in which candidates were engaged in auctioning themselves to bring more goods back to the districts and not to work out the search for national policies. So the big weakening of the American parties it's been going on gradually for a very long time. In some ways, the rot set in with Andrew Jackson when they abolished the system by which the congressional party leadership selected the presidential candidates. That at least would make the system function more like, make the president a little bit more like a prime minister and accountable to the president's party in Congress. But then the next big wave of destructive reforms was, of course, the progressives, who, with the sort of the starry-eyed naivety of bringing more democracy to the people, instituted primaries, which have had this horrific effect. And primaries, of course, have been around in Congress for more than a century, but their corrosive effects have become worse because of redistricting and demographic changes, which have produced a world in which the vast majority of seats are safe seats now, and so the primaries are much more important than they used to be. And then the McGovern-Fraser reforms after 1968 further weakened parties by making primaries much more important in presidential contests and achieving much more grassroots control of parties. If the party leadership in Congress, not smoke-filled rooms and party bosses, but if the party leadership in Congress has a much bigger role in selecting candidates for office, then they have an incentive to pick people who can both win in their district and support a national program that they're going to get behind. And that's what you really want. You want party leaderships to have an incentive to try and maximize the number of people who can do that. And so I would say I agree that abolishing primaries is a bridge too far. They're too deeply now ingrained in the American DNA. But since, if you think about what's a marketable reform with respect to primaries, one could say, well, because most people don't realize that the main issue with primaries is very low turnout, one could imagine trying to sell a reform which said, if the primary turnout is less than 75% of the general election turnout in that district in the previous election or the previous two elections or some such thing, then the party leadership in the House will have a much bigger say in selecting the candidate. But basically, what one needs is reforms of that sort that will reverse the decentralization of control of political parties, which makes them vulnerable to the sort of hostile takeovers that we saw in the Republican presidential primaries with Donald Trump, and we see at a micro level in legislative races all the time. So why don't I stop there?
Great. I want to open it up in a second, but just one opening question, and particularly like to invite commentary from Francis Lee, who's done so much work on political competition. The theme of political competition, of course, is a deep one in political science. It goes back to Schumpeter, thinking about politics as competitive struggle for power. But I'm wondering about the central claim that it is the case that parties and coalition can pursue policies that matter to their bases, their primary voters, and their donors, and not to ordinary voters without paying a political penalty. I think a case can be made that there is often a very large electoral cost to pursuing those policies. Mo Fiorina has written about the cost to overreach, which he defines as when parties are pursuing policies that are either more extreme than of interest to ordinary voters, or prioritizing issues that are not important to ordinary voters. And so some examples, Bill Clinton back in the early 90s pursued a health care reform, very important to the Democratic base. Activists paid a huge electoral penalty for that. The Gingrich Congress came in. They thought that they were going to pursue the conservative agenda. They had talk radio behind them. They had primary voters, and they were their donors were on board. They attacked programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and they had an electoral wipeout. George W. Bush, pursued Social Security privatization. This was very important to conservative think tanks, to activists, to intellectuals on the right, to donors who had a big stake in that. That did not work out so well. And even Obama, in pursuing the Affordable Care Act in the aftermath of the Great Recession, it was very, very important to progressive thinkers, to Democratic base, but it was not the priority of Democratic average voters at that time. And of course, he faced a very big penalty. So I'm very prepared to believe that competitive forces don't guarantee perfect responsiveness to public opinion, nor does it guarantee perfect problem solving, but isn't it the case that our system does ensure that when parties pursue agendas that are not popular with ordinary voters, they're taking a big electoral risk?
Yes, they take an electoral risk, but they don't take a risk to their existence or their continued growth and power. In fact, sometimes if you look at the political industrial complex writ large, they are able to attract more investment and more and grow in power by being out of power than by being in power, because their side wants to put them back in power. So we're looking for the type of competition that would incent solutions over time. And this is, I see from a business perspective, the only industry where we say that a solution to bad outcomes would be less competition. So for example, the answer to fake news would not be Google and Facebook being more powerful or exempt from competition, no matter how well-intentioned they promise to be, because markets and incentives don't work that way. So the problem here is that these two parties are guaranteed to continue to be the only two entities offering solutions, no matter whether they respond over the long term to the problems that we have. So that's what the unhealthy, competition piece is that they pay an electoral price, but they don't pay a price for their continued existence, and they can reform and come back, but it's unrelated to the longer term public interest. It's simply related to being marginally more preferred than the one other choice.
Let me go to Francis first.
I'll just make one quick point on the question of competition and the idea of voters as consumers, and that metaphor that you use in the report. That, in other words, that parties compete for voters based on their national policies, and saying that or that's your ideal, or what you'd like to see. But what candidates compete on and what parties compete on are the positions that they take, not on the policies that result, because they cannot be held accountable for policies that result. They don't have sufficient power. This is a Mayhew point. This is individual politicians can't be held accountable for the outcomes of government, nor can political parties. We have divided government 75% of the time. So neither parties nor individual candidates can be held accountable for outcomes. What they're held accountable for in that marketplace are the positions they take. And so that can produce some very problematic political incentives, because it's the stands, it's the point scoring, it's the pie in the sky proposals that sound good to people who don't know very much about the trade-offs involved. That those are the kinds of problematic forms of political competition that I think we see between candidates and between parties that can't really be addressed either by weakening political parties, as your approach would do with the jungle primary, or by strengthening parties within a separation of power system. Neither, I think, are solutions.
Let me make a quick point, by the way. We're not for the weakening of political parties. I think that's a misunderstanding. What we are for is taking the political parties out of control of the elections machinery and the legislative machinery, which is to say, we actually think if you change the rules of the game, you could return to strong parties in a certain element, which is they could select their own candidates. They're not forced to take the candidates selected by the public in a low turnout primary. I mean, I'm not suggesting they go back to smoke-filled rooms, but they can own their own candidates, because in the four-way primary, which we definitely don't like to call a jungle primary, in the open forward primary, you you could have easily two Republicans moving forward, and then the party selects which one is their candidate. They self-identify, but the party doesn't have to take them. So that gives parties a huge strength that the existing primary system does not give them, but it doesn't give them a strength of control over the systems that belong to the public. So it's not a complete weakening of parties.
We also, just on the record, we think duopoly is not inherently bad. It's not that you have two competitors. We think that's a pretty decent outcome that is in general good. But it's how those two duopolists are competing. That's what we're concerned about. It's not that there's two. It's the rules that have been set up and the incentives that have been set up that cause them to compete in the way they do. If we look back 30, 40, 50 years in America, the nature of party competition wasn't the same. We got a lot of collaboration and compromise. We had a whole different culture of collegiality and trying to solve problems. We got a lot of great legislation passed, and that was with two parties. But the two parties were very different. They were organized differently. The rules were different, and it's that we are concerned about. We also, in some ways, it's clear that parties have also gotten stronger. Maybe they've gotten weaker, but they've also gotten stronger. They now control the way legislation is enacted in Congress. They literally control. The bill doesn't have to get voted on anymore unless the party leadership wants to. Another thing we didn't have time to cover is the parties have now infiltrated our other institutions. They've infiltrated our executive branch and who gets appointed to public office. They're the qualification are partisanship and party votes. They've infiltrated our independent regulatory agencies. The commissioners now are party loyalists. They're not people selected on competence and even-handedness. And again, our court system has now been really heavily captured by the parties. So I can see the argument for why parties are weakened in some respects, but the influence and the value that they are delivering now to their partisans and their special interest is much greater. And you all know the literature on lobbying is, the ROI of lobbying is very high. The parties can really deliver goodies for the special interest and the partisans that support them, and that we see increasingly is the game that's being played. So these are all excellent points, and we welcome those and many more. So have at it. We're not. We'd love to hear this stuff.
So Bill's next, and there's a microphone which I will pick up and walk around so that it can be recorded. Bill.
Well, Ian made an uncharacteristic factual mistake, which actually points to the heart of what I want to say. In fact, half of the Republican Party supported Medicare. It was not a straight party line vote, anything but. I'm sorry?
They voted against it before they voted for it.
Oh,
There were
okay.
10 Republican congressmen who voted
Somebody should
for
write
it.
an article.
Okay, but
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, half the
They
Republicans.
switched sides.
Right,
They
okay,
switched
but-
Social Security. There was one Republican
Okay.
that voted for it before they
Okay,
switched.
but the point I want to make is that today they wouldn't switch, right? And
That's the point.
and and so the point I want to make, building on what Michael just said, is that the structural analysis leaves something out. The party system was every bit as much a duopoly in 1965 as it is now. As a matter of fact, if I had more time, I would make the argument that barriers to entry are actually lower now than they were. They're certainly lower than they were in 1980, and if I had more time, I'd explain why I know that to a fairly well. And so it cannot be a duopoly protected from disruptive new entrants, full stop, that explains the changes that you just acknowledged. You started talking about culture, right? You started talking, culture of cooperation. Many of us would go on to talk about changes in the geographical structure and bases of the parties and the great sorting out that's occurred along ideological lines, et cetera. In other words, the structural analysis misses the historical changes that I think drive a lot of the dysfunction that we're here to talk about.
On the culture point, I would just say that people don't cooperate and are collegial because they literally get punished by their party leadership. you're not allowed to be bipartisan. You're not allowed to, you're heavily censured by the leadership when taking that kind of stance. So, yes, the culture has changed. Yes, people from different parties don't share, hotel rooms or, in Washington anymore. But that's partly because that is not viewed as acceptable behavior from the point of view of party leadership. So I think there's a mix. In some ways, parties have gotten much stronger. In some ways, you're right, they're weaker. I do agree that there's a lot of changes in our country and our demographics and so forth, and those are complicated. But we come back over and over again to these rules of the game that have changed, starting heavily in the 1960s, that have created this shift in strategy and this sense that really the core people that the parties are trying to serve are not the middle, but they're the partisans that they have where they try to deliver value. So I don't know, Catherine, you may want to comment, but we want to open it up.
There is an optimization of competition in every industry over time. So I agree with you that in some ways there are theoretically lower barriers to entry, but by the same token, the political industrial complex has learned to optimize its performance under the existing rules, which is to say, I think that both sides used to think they had to deal with the trade-offs issue in their policies and positions, which is to say they had to say, well, this will cost X, so we would have to pay for it with Y. But over time, both parties, both sides of the complex have realized, oh, we don't have to do that. We can just be for all these things and none of us have to pay for them. We don't have to powerfully deal with trade-offs anymore in the existing system of competition. So what happens is they get better at existing under this set of rules over time. And the reason we don't pay attention to historical changes as much is because we're super focused on where we would have leverage. So it would be really powerful if we could change the media or change larger transitions in our culture. But since we could not find a point of leverage into those, we focus our analysis on things where we could have leverage.
Well, one of the two major parties has just undergone a major disruption, a hostile takeover, which has forced many previously powerful people in the Republican Party to leave it outright. So there are costs to ignoring the outside forces, including a lot of very discontented people. So I don't accept the proposition that this system has immunized itself. Not at all.
Well, you're absolutely right that all my friends in Congress have left, all my friends in the Senate, they're all gone because they can't stand it. They can't stand working somewhere where they're not solving problems for citizens. And so, we would say that this set of rule changes and structure that we describe is capturing, where that divergence is, a lot of it is coming from. But, this is hellishly complicated, so
Nolan is next.
more questions.
Yeah, so my point is just basically a follow-up on what Bill just said. If you take your industrial duopoly analogy very seriously, what you would expect for a very successful duopoly is there being kind of increasing rents and security for the upper management of those firms. And I think we see exactly the opposite, just as Bill pointed out. There's so much contestation for the control of both parties. We focused a lot on the Republican Party in 2016, but it's important to remember that Hillary Clinton had to fight all the way to the convention against someone who is not even a member of the party. Talk about a potentially hostile takeover. So I think the analysis really has to capture the competition that's going on within parties. Because if Facebook turned over, had a new CEO every month, we wouldn't really be talking about the entrenchment of Facebook because no individual person is entrenching their power, their resources in that way. And so the way I see the party system is really there are these shells that have some, as you point out, have some legal advantages, legal protection, creates competition for them. But that competition itself has a profound impact on politics that I really think needs to be taken into consideration in your analysis.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I think there is an important difference between the intense competition within the parties, but also within each side of the political industrial complex for
control essentially of who gets to be in, shall we say, the room where it happens. And this is a large part of the competition that's occurring, and that makes us think that competition in the political industry is actually robust. But it's not competition to serve the public interest. And so the reason we want to change these rules of the game to open up new competition is so that someone who wants to run doesn't have to take over one of the existing two options. They can actually mount their own separate party or effort with lower barriers to entry. So we would not see as much fighting over one of the only two shells that, in each of the only two shells that are currently available to make a case to the public. So we want, and that changes it from this dysfunctional internal competition to a healthier, external, more transparent competition to create more shells, shall we say.
Great. So this is really interesting, and as someone who teaches business school, it's also great you in person, Dr. Porter. So should just say, I think thinking about like how to map this to the way that political scientists are used to thinking about it. I think a lot of the literature about solutions to polarizations think about parties, like the essence of parties as control of nominations. And a lot of the solutions are trying to think about ways to change who controls nominations. And I think part of what's interesting about your analysis is that you're basically trying to say, well, we should try to sidestep that and not try to change who controls nominations and just make it less valuable to control nominations by having this kind of four-way elections or whatever else. And so I think that's like an interesting way to think about it, is to kind of give up on the question of who controls nominations and say, kind of make it matter less. So I live in a city, San Francisco, where we have ranked choice voting. I don't know how many other places in the U.S. do this. I think not many. But I think this kind of exposes one of the other ways that the analogy from markets to politics breaks down, which is that individual participants in markets, customers, have pretty strong incentives to choose well when deciding how to spend their money, whereas individual voters basically don't have any incentives to cast votes that are correct in any way. And so, like, if I buy a certain car or a certain loaf of bread or whatever, that directly affects me, whereas how I vote individually is inconsequential for the outcome of the election. And so that's an old point going back to Downs, that just voters don't have any incentives to be informed or think through policies. And California writ large is just a great example of just all of the crazy things that happen when you, like, delegate the control of government policy to the collection of a bunch of people who have no incentive to think about government policy. And so, one way that, and I think we see that with ranked choice voting in San Francisco as well, where it's essentially a nonpartisan city because everyone's a Democrat. And so I think we sort of have your ideal of like what you'd like to see, where there's no parties anymore, there's all these individual candidates, yet you still see the very clear emergence of two stable coalitions. They don't appear on the ballot, but all the interest groups still organize themselves in the same way. So when I was voting for my supervisor, there was 5 candidates I could have chosen between, but you can clearly tell in how the interest groups align. There are 2 big factions. They call themselves the moderates and the progressives, but they still emerge, and you still get basically exactly the same dynamics you're worried about in the kind of political system that I think you would regard as kind of setting up the best incentives. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think part of it has to do with voter ignorance and just kind of disinterest in learning about the details of policy, and part of it has to do with the fact that interest groups still have incentives to try to combine and form coalitions and form these clubs and do all the other stuff that they do. So I think that'd be an interesting case to look at to try to figure out how would these strategic actors react to the incentives that you're setting up. And one way to potentially, think about, a solution to this, and why I think many in the room, myself included, are kind of fans of this idea of stronger parties, would be to analogize parties to regulators, where, if you think about even customers who are not going to understand all the safety features of a car or do research into the food safety practices of restaurants that eat at or whatever else, you think of regulators as basically there to try to audit and set up practices and conduct some screening that individual customers and voters aren't going to be able to spend the time to do. And so if you look at other systems like the systems in the UK, for example, you could think of parties as kind of playing that role. And I think there's lots of examples. This, like, How Democracies Die book, I think is full of great kind of accessible examples of how parties worldwide have basically tried to hold back populist challengers and extremist candidates, basically acted in ways that are basically very consistent with this kind of cartel dynamics, but in ways that are very good because they're holding back these kind of populist candidates that say lots of things that sound good to voters who aren't thinking about things very much, even though they have disastrous long-term consequences. So, insofar as part of what regulators do in markets is like insulate firms from market competition to do things like abandon food safety standards or whatever else, in politics, there's a lot of that that's actually healthy and that we want parties to do. And so I think thinking about those healthy forces could be useful, as well as some of the pathologies that would still exist in a system where kind of some of your reforms were implemented.
I mean, we can respond to everything or hear from more people.
I'm just going to a quick two-finger on David's point, just to talk also about donor behavior. So you talk a lot about how we can break this from the ground up in terms of grassroots voters and giving voters more opportunity. I tend to also agree with the results from the California primary seem to have solidified the Democrats' hold on California, that open primary system, rather than encouraging competition and responsiveness. But also donor behavior. This is our classic problem, right? I mean, it's also Downsians and Riker, and, you waste a vote. You don't want to waste a vote. So if you're a donor, the only source I could imagine that would support these sort of independent new entrants into the political field would be like venture capitalists saying, okay, I'm going to be a really wealthy person, and I'm going to support this new party or this different party to go into the system, but then that gives an elite backing to that person, and it's unclear that person would ultimately be more responsive to the average voter than anybody who's currently part of the two-party system. So how do you foresee donor behavior changing in this environment, or how do you think the incentives would change for them to fund some of this newfound competition you're trying to create? Thanks.
That is certainly a key question, the role of money in politics, and we see it as corrosive. As does everybody, really. So in our situation, we think of this industry as unique because it has two currencies that matter. It has votes and it has money. And the key problem right now is within the duopoly, the currency of votes is subservient to the currency of money, because votes in these gerrymandered districts and through the partisan primary system are in some cases taken for granted, and more in absolute terms is not better. You only need 50% plus one, so you don't care if people stay home. Whereas the other currency of money, more is always better. So we don't go after aggressively money in politics by trying to get it out of politics. What we want to see through healthier competition is a reduction of the return on investment that wealthy, self-interested donors can currently command with their money in politics. And we want to see a reduction of the certainty, the scale of the return on investment and the certainty of the return on investment, which is to say, right now, if you're a donor, you know that the investment that you're making in supporting this ex-primary candidate, the Republican candidate in this Republican gerrymandered district, post the primary, is going to pay off with a great deal of certainty. So we think that the way to get money out of politics is to reduce the certainty by increasing the competition, and you don't know exactly how that's going to play out in nearly as many races as you currently know today. Money goes where it gets its ROI, and by elevating the currency of votes over the currency of money, that's where we can see a difference, because essentially the donor isn't going to put $5 million into this race because it gets no return if that person doesn't win. So finally, votes once again become more important than money, and that's a key way we see this change.
So we have 5 more minutes. So one more question. I wasn't sure if Ian wanted to get in real quick or no.
Just on this question of money, I would just say that all of the conversation, or virtually all of the conversation about money in politics, today included, focuses on the supply side. And what people should really focus on is the demand side. Why do politicians need so much money? And it's because the parties are weak. Retail campaigning is much more expensive than wholesale campaigning. If you look at countries with stronger parties, they don't have any need of money. Primary campaigns require huge amounts of money, but individual politicians need money to protect themselves. And so Rick Peldas has written interesting work on this.
So final question, please.
So my question actually, I think, relates to this currency question, because it strikes me that, I think everybody in this room has used the model of a market to talk about politics. But there's one big difference, which is there's one currency in a traditional market, right? Everybody's trying to maximize profits. But I think there's an issue here that different people are trying to maximize different things, right? Some people are trying to maximize money. Parties are trying to maximize votes or probability of winning, and other people are trying to maximize these sort of ideological outcomes, right? And so I think one of the things this question with Mike Castle, I think a lot of us are sort of thinking, well, but the Republicans wanted Mike Castle, right? They didn't want Christine O'Donnell because she's a loon and she lost that election. And, well, she may be a witch, but she's definitely a loon. And so the parties didn't get what they wanted out of there, right? So to me, that's a story, and I think other people are saying this as well, of increased competition, because the Republicans would have been much happier if Christine O'Donnell had never left her house. But I think the larger question here then is, what if what parties are doing is keeping not only Christine O'Donnell's of the world out of politics, but lots of other people out of politics? Like maybe this sort of the good old days of the 1940s when everybody got along was because there were a whole mess of people who were not included in politics. So is it possible that's what's going on now isn't as nice and isn't as friendly, but is just because there are more people involved and the parties are weaker, so they can't keep some of these voices out? And maybe is that a good thing to sort of take to say, okay, we're going to keep people out of the debate so that it can be nicer?
Yeah, so in a democracy, I don't think we can have the answer be that we would keep people out of the debate, but that could also be one of these factors where things change, where we don't have leverage to change it, or changing it simply wouldn't be morally correct. But I would like to talk about your other point about whether parties are strong or weak relative to the primary. We would suggest that the political industrial complex is in some ways too strong for its own good, which is that the industrial complex, parties and all their industry allies, can keep out new competition, but because that was so anathema to the progressives, for example, they forced the political system to cede some illusion of control to citizens by allowing citizens to have a say in selecting the nominees of, each of these two parties. And the unintended consequence of this reform, which is the one case where, the parties lost control, is that it hasn't been good for the parties or the public interest. So in our, reform, as I said before, we actually would like to return the control of candidates and who is the standard bearer for those parties to the actual political parties themselves, and not pretend to give it to the citizens, and then the citizens will choose between the options, candidates, policies, platforms, positions that the parties put in front of them. And the parties are then actually accountable, more so all the way through, because they do control who their candidates are or are not. So that's, our ideal situation of these free and healthy rules of the game, free and fair competition, combined with parties controlling the actual totality of their offering to the citizen.
Just one comment from me, and very quickly, and that is, we've not talked much about, to me, the central fundamental question here, and that is what outcomes are the parties delivering for the society. And that fundamentally comes down to what bills are being proposed, with what structures, and what bills are being voted on, and what bills are being passed. And right now, we're not passing anything that really matters. And whenever we pass something, it's only because of party dominance they can pass the bill themselves. So ultimately, I think we have to expand this discussion to really get at the question of what is the nature of legislation and policy that spits out of this system, and where is that coming from? And our simple analysis is that that there's a sort of a canceling process here, which has essentially slowed down almost to a complete stop the production of legislation, and that it's very, very rare now that the legislation can reflect the reality of good policy, which is complexity and multiple points of view and things that have to be reconciled. And we've destroyed the machine that used to be able to do that much more often than it does today. So hopefully, and I'd love to hear any thoughts from any of you about this, you know, the ultimate thing we want this system to deliver is good policies and good legislation that moves the country forward, that solves gun violence, that deals with a failure of public education, that deals with all these problems we have. And right now, that is what got me, you know, riveted on this issue. It's just not happening.
In my book, any panel that ends with a call for more detailed study of public policy is a good panel. So I want to end there and thank the panelists.